At the beginning of the program tonight, we looked at the addition of highly toxic alkyl leads into the nation's petrol at Marsden Point. This is back in the 60s and 70s. Lead was banned from New Zealand petrol in 1996. Two former workers at the refinery told us imported leads were added to the petrol there and that they had no idea of the extent of the risk involved. One of them, Brian Arndt, told me the workers did that, how they did it, and what's happened to him since.
We removed an outer cap by we placed the drum on a roller bed, turned the drum so the cap was uppermost, removed the cap and removed an internal plug, and then you were within 60 centimetres of the surface of the lead inside the drum.
So you had taken the cap off and the drum was open to you at that point. Could you smell the lead?
Yes, you could. Even though you had an air mask on, you could smell it. And we just had plain white overalls and, if they were available, a pair of underpants to wear underneath them and a sweatshirt in the winter. We were given no induction training outlining the risks or procedures or, in the case of spillage, what to do. There was no training given with this product. We were not aware of any dangers. In the 1980s, I started getting squamous carcinomas, which is now positively attributed to the toxic effect of tetraethyl lead in particular passing through the skin. I also then, in the late 80s, became aware of a heartache or ache around my heart in the left lung, and there was a large tumour removed from my left lung. In 2009, I was diagnosed with a oddball tumour in my right breast. I had a complete mastectomy. And then early 2012, I had radical radiation and hormonal treatment on my prostate. I had a tumour that was 57 millimetres big. I then discovered a tumour growing in my left breast, and that was removed. In 2013, my oncologist sat down with me and said a peer review had been done by his colleagues. They couldn't figure out why I had all these cancers and problems. I ran through my work history of life, and when I got to working at the refinery, he said, no, not hydrocarbon, different cancer. When I said tetraethyl lead, he said, oh my God, you've got to be kidding me.
Brian Arndt, the workers we spoke to, both who worked there in the 60s and 70s, told Checkpoint sludge containing the toxic leads was dumped into sand near the coastline beside Marsden Point. The Northland Regional Council and the refinery say lead levels are below national standards in the area, but the last test they've been able to confirm to Checkpoint was in 1995. All of this has arisen in the week the Dunedin study has reported a link between exposure to lead and lower IQs in children. That risk was central to the campaign to ban lead from petrol. It was banned from petrol in New Zealand in 1996 and in many countries earlier than that. A New Zealand-born Brit, Des Wilson, was a key figure in the campaign to have lead banned, widely credited with having a very influential role in that happening. He told me from England he was alerted to the risk from lead in petrol fumes by a scientist who persuaded him to take it seriously.
And once we started looking into it, we found that there were actually a whole series of studies around the world, but particularly in America, that confirmed that children could have their brains affected, their intelligence and their behaviour affected at a far lower level of exposure than anyone had realised. And when you realise that lead is a neurotoxin, that is to say a brain poison in effect, there is no more effective way of reaching every child in the country than spraying it out of car exhausts. And that's what we were doing. Cars were driving up and down streets and roads emitting a brain poison that affected children.
And at first, when you began campaigning to get the lead out of petrol, because of the risk to children, for example, what was the response from the people who put the lead in?
The industry, that's to say the lead industry, the lead additive industry, to some extent the car manufacturers and to some extent the petroleum companies, all kind of ganged up. And their basic line was that really we were just a bunch of nutters. We were exaggerating the problem massively, and the government supported them. And, they did their best to position this as just irresponsible and exaggerating the problem. But unfortunately for them, every piece of evidence that came down supported us and not them. And in the end, the government simply couldn't withstand the pressure.
Sometime after you achieved success with your campaign in the UK and Europe, and I think Japan was first and so on, you came to New Zealand to campaign here. Do you remember the response in New Zealand?
So I arrived at a weekend and we began the campaign on a Monday, and on the Tuesday the Minister of Energy, Mr. Bob Tizard, recorded a television interview in which he described me as a fool. And basically what he said was, and it was an incredible remark, he said, what he's talking about is children in Britain. But until he can convince me that children in New Zealand are affected by lead and petrol, I don't intend to act. And to which my reply was, well, they were taking it out of petrol in America, Australia, Japan, the whole of Europe. What was it about New Zealand children that made them the only children in the world that were not affected by lead pollution? It was ridiculous. And 3 days later, he was forced by his own government to announce that they were going to take lead out of petrol.
I wonder if we can return to the reaction of the people who were making the lead additives, who earned their livelihood by producing this. One person I've spoken to said they were as protective and as defensive as big tobacco. Now that's pretty strong. Am I going too far there?
No, you're not. I mean, the main company in the UK, which in fact made lead additives that sold right across the world, that company was called Associated Octal, and it employed huge lobbying firms, paid scientists, took scientists on their staff to argue their case. They called us everything under the sun. In fact, I found that they had found a way of finding out wherever I was going around the country, appearing on radio programs, and their PR man would literally turn up on the doorstep of the radio program the day I was there in order to try and counterbalance our case. They did everything they could. Just as the tobacco companies, even though there were over 150,000 studies that show that smoking is bad for health, still refused to acknowledge it. Well, it's the same with the lead additive people. Don't forget, this was their whole business was at stake, and they had two choices: either to admit that their product was a threat to the health of children, and basically find another way of making money, or they had to try and rubbish us. And of course, they tried to rubbish us. I mean, that's the game.
Des Wilson, quite a remarkable person, Des Wilson. Well, not quite a remarkable person, a truly admirable one. Waitaki Boys High School boy, but moved to the UK, I think, when he was about 19 and has been there ever since. Really influential figure in British politics.